Welcome to the Anderson Lecture, which we have in honour of the Anderson Chair in Psychology, which we reckon is the oldest chair in psychology in the UK. And it's my enormous pleasure to welcome Professor Nicola Clayton, who is the Professor of Comparative Cognition at the University of Cambridge. Among the many, many indicators of her very illustrious scientific career, she was made a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2010. Her research combines aspects of psychology, of biology, of neuroscience, and really brings them together in ways that inform all of those different disciplines. And her research has challenged kind of quite fundamental assumptions about what animals do and don't know, what they can and can't do, and shows some incredible feats of what, for example, crows can do, what they can think about, what they understand, what they can do in terms of mental time travel and their social intelligence. As well as Professor Nicola Clayton's outstanding scientific career, she's a dancer, and she has a whole parallel life, which is probably unique, certainly amongst some people I've met, where as well as doing incredible science, she dances, and she's involved in some very unusual and unique creative collaborations that link together science and art. So, for example, she is a scientist in residence at the Roller Dance Company. So I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Nicola Clayton to give this Anderson Lecture here in Aberdeen. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Louise, and for inviting me. Can you all hear me okay? Thank you. Ways of thinking. I've said from Corvids to children and back again because I would like to share with you some of the research that I and my team of people have been doing over the past few years, exploring the cognitive capacities of non-verbal animals, specifically crows or members of the crow family or corvids. I shall use those words interchangeably. So a corvid or a crow simply means members of that family of Corvidae, they're called, which includes the jays, the ravens, the magpies, rooks, crows, and jackdaws. And I'm going to compare those abilities with some of the aspects that we've developed looking in young children, in pre-verbal children. Now, what I'm not saying throughout this talk is that a jay or a crow is like a child of age 4, age 6, age 8, any age, in fact. Clearly they're not. There's a number of fundamental and very important differences between crows and children. Crows have wings, children have hands. There we go. That's a big, important difference between them. But what I am interested in is what capabilities they share and what things are different, and how this might help advance our understanding of the evolution of cognition. And I'm going to assess 3 pieces of evidence in today's public lecture. The first concerns their social cognition. Now, what these birds do, such as the jay pictured here on your left, is they cache food. That means they hide the food, typically by a burial. But the thing is that they go to great lengths to steal or pilfer other birds' caches, as well as protect their own caches from this pilfering. Now, we call it pilfering specifically. For these purposes, it's more or less synonymous with theft or stealing. But the reason we use the word pilfering is to make it clear that we're not making any assumptions about whether the birds understand own caches versus others, and therefore technically if they don't make that distinction, then strictly speaking we shouldn't really be calling it theft, but in common parlance I mean the same thing. And typically in the wild, a scrub jay such as this Western California scrub jay pictured here, they lose about 30% of their caches of hidden food to pilferage by other individuals. Now, this is true of many food caching species, squirrels, for example. But what sets the crows, the corvids, apart from other animals that cache food is that they have observational memory. And that means that they can watch where another bird is hiding the food, and on the basis of looking and watching, they can remember where those caches are. And we think that that's led to the increasing complexity of tactics that they use to protect their caches, because rather than having to rely on another bird being there in the here and now and perhaps being dominant and chasing them off and stealing it, subordinate individuals can also return to the caches when the other birds have left the scene and steal them at will. And they go to a number of lengths to protect their caches. I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, they use distance. If other birds are watching, they're much more likely to cache the food as far away from those other individuals as possible, which makes it harder for the caches to be detected. They also use shade rather than sunlight, and they show a preference to hide the food behind barriers when others are watching, all things that they don't do when they cache in private when other birds aren't around. But perhaps the most striking tactic that we discovered was that birds will re-hide the food that the observer watched them cache. And I noticed this at first when I was a newly appointed assistant professor at the University of California, Davis, and I would like to walk during lunch hour. And I would notice that very often these Californian scrub jays would come down onto the campus. They'd cache the food, and more or less immediately thereafter, they would collect the food and move it to new places. And I noticed that they seemed to do this when there were lots of other birds around. If they were on their own, they didn't seem to do this rapid recaching or rehiding of the food. So we set up an experiment to test this hypothesis. We had the cacher, the bird that's hiding the food, was either observed, watched by another bird in a nearby cage, looking through a window, or it was caching in private. And each bird had both of those things. It had one caching event where it was watched by another bird, and one caching event where it cached in private. And then 3 hours later, having removed the trays and the caches, we put the trays back into the bird's cage and watched to see whether or not they recovered the caches that they'd hidden, and if so, what they did with them. And the prediction was that if this recaching was really due to the threat of others watching them cache, and it was a cache protection tactic, then the bird should preferentially move the ones that they'd cached in front of the observer. In other words, the one, in this case, from the purple observed tray, rather than from the brown in private tray. And what we found was that was exactly the case. They're much more, this is the mean number of items that they've moved or rehidden, and you see that they're much more likely to move the ones that they'd cached when they'd been observed than the ones they'd cached in private. And when they're moving them, they're specifically moving them to new places, which by definition the observer doesn't know about, because this moving of items is always done after the potential thieves or pilferers have left the scene. So this recaching is always done in private. But perhaps the even more striking finding was that not all birds do this. It's only those that have experience of pilfering, hence the label experienced thieves. Naive birds who haven't had the opportunity to steal the other birds' caches do hardly any recaching at all. And it's important to say that this was just a one-off task, so it's not that the birds have had the opportunity to learn by trial and error that this is what is effective strategy. This is a one-off. They never get these caches they've moved back. And the idea is that this is a particularly complex kind of social cognition. We called it, it takes a thief to know a thief. And the idea here is that the bird is projecting its own experience onto that of another bird. So the cacher recalls its previous experience of being a thief and then predicts what the observer might do by analogy with its own behaviour. So you can think of it as putting yourself in another's shoes.
Look at John. Can mommy see?
No.
Okay, look. Here's a sticker. Place this again here, and whoops, there it goes. Now I'm on the other side again.
Get it.
So the idea behind this child version of experience projection is that the child, as you saw, is playing a little game with the experimenter. And Mummy either has her eyes open or her eyes closed when the sticker, which is out of the child's reach, is being put in a container. And previous experiments by Daniela O'Neill and Christina Attance have shown that when Mummy can't see when the sticker is being put in the baited container, then once Mummy opens her eyes again, the children spontaneously point, as that little child did there, and just say, go get it. Whereas if Mummy's eyes were open when the sticker was being put in the container, they'd just say, give me the sticker, please. And the idea here was, are the children able, based on whether Mummy's eyes are open or not, to understand that when Mummy can see, she will know where the sticker has been hidden. When Mummy can't see, perhaps because her eyes have been covered by her hands, that because she can't see, she won't know where the sticker is. So this is a way of investigating, does seeing lead to knowing, and does not seeing lead to not knowing? And in our experiment, we replicated the Attance and O'Neill finding, where Mummy can see or Mummy can't see because her eyes are covered. But we wanted to introduce two artificial conditions, because we thought, well, children will have had, even by 2 years of age, some experience of playing peekaboo games, and therefore knowing that this leads to not seeing, just through having lots of experience, through trial and error, if you like. So we wanted to introduce two artificial conditions in which Mummy wears some swimming goggles, and these are mirrored so you can't see whether she can see through them or not. And we simply put some blue or yellow funky shapes on the goggles so that they can be discriminated amongst. And in the first experiment, the children first have experience of wearing the goggles, and therefore they can use their own first-hand experience to know whether you can see through the yellow ones or the blue ones. Now, in this particular example, it's the blue ones that you can see through. The yellow ones are the opaque ones. But obviously, for half the children, blue are seeing, and for half the children, yellow are seeing, so that we counterbalance, it's called. We control to make sure that it isn't something special, that children just like blue over yellow, or vice versa. So the children get experience of putting on the goggles, and therefore they can see through one set of goggles and not through the other. And then Mummy puts the goggles on. And in both cases, whether Mummy's wearing the goggles or her eyes are covered or not, we ask the children, can Mummy see? We then play the little game you saw in the video, and during which the sticker is hidden in one of the cups, when either Mummy can see because her eyes are open, or because she's wearing the goggles that you can see through, or she can't see because her eyes are covered, or she's wearing the goggles that you can't see through. And then we see whether or not the child spontaneously points to the container. And then, to make sure that the children haven't forgotten whether or not Mummy can see, we ask the can Mummy see question again. So this is what the experiments look like. If we look first at the can Mummy see, you see that we replicated the original experiments, that when Mummy's eyes are open and they can see her eyes, they say, yes, Mummy can see. When Mummy's eyes are covered with her hands, they say, no, Mummy can't see. And they have no problem inferring from their first-hand experience of wearing the goggles which goggles Mummy can see through, namely the transparent ones, and which ones Mummy can't see through, namely the opaque ones. Now, as Attance and O'Neill found, when Mummy's eyes are open, they're much less likely to point to the container than if Mummy's eyes are covered. However, if Mummy's wearing the goggles, there's no difference between the two conditions. In both cases, when they can't see her eyes, they are much more likely to point. So it seems to be that if they can see that mummy's eyes are open, they know to point. But if mummy's eyes are covered and they've got to infer whether or not she knows based on answering the question, can mummy see or not, they don't differentiate between these two. So in the artificial conditions, another way of saying that result is to say they answer the can mummy see question correctly, but they don't differentiate between those conditions in terms of pointing. They can't see mummy's eyes, irrespective of whether or not she can see, they point. So that suggests that there's a dissociation between seeing and knowing. They're not understanding that seeing leads to knowing, and that not seeing necessarily leads to not knowing. So in the second experiment, what we did was now the children don't have any first-hand experience of wearing the goggles, and this is a different set of children. You can't use the same children because they simply repeat the experience from the previous experiments. You have to use different ones, but another group of 2-year-old children, and now mummy wears the goggles and they watch mummy's behaviour, and when mummy can see through the goggles, she's able to get her keys out of a handbag, and she's able to stack boxes on top of one another and do all the things that normal mummies that can see normally do. And when mummy's wearing the goggles that she can't see through, she can't find the keys, she's clumsy and knocks the boxes over, and she fumbles with the bag and does all those kinds of things that mummies do when they can't see. And then we ask the child, can mummy see? So now the child has to use their experience of watching how mummy behaved to infer whether or not mummy can see. And then we play the little game again with the sticker and see whether or not the children point. And what we find is that in the naturalistic conditions, when they've got the presence or absence of mummy's eyes to use, sure enough, when mummy's eyes are open, they say mummy can see, and when mummy's eyes are open, they're much less likely to point than when mummy's eyes are covered, just as you would expect. However, the pattern of results in the artificial conditions with the goggles is different. Here, they're not able to infer from mummy's behaviour whether or not she can see. In both cases, the natural tendency is to assume that in the absence of seeing mummy's eyes, mummy can't see. But it's not that they can't differentiate mummy's behaviour, because when it comes to pointing, they are able to correctly infer that when mummy was being clumsy and fumbling with her bag and her keys and everything, they're much more likely to point than they are in the condition when mummy was able and had no problems removing her car keys and stacking boxes and so on. So here we have a double dissociation. In the first experiment, they passed the can mummy see question, but didn't differentiate in pointing as to whether mummy could or couldn't see. In this experiment, they're answering in the artificial conditions the can mummy see question incorrectly. They're inferring that she can't see, but they are able to use her behaviour partially to infer whether or not they need to point. So in both cases, we've got a dissociation here between seeing and knowing, suggesting that at age 2, these children have difficulty with this experience projection about the significance of seeing for whether or not mummy has access to that information or not. Now, I'd love to be able to say that we ran older children and could show you a point at which they passed it. The problem with that is that when we test 3- and 4-year-old children, they point to one of the wrong containers. There are 7 containers, so there's 6 in which the sticker isn't hidden, and then just say, tricked mummy, ha ha ha, which is rather clever of them and great fun, but it's problematic for what we can infer about what those results mean. So just to wrap up the first section on social cognition, I'm arguing that the fact that the children are finding these experience projection quite difficult is striking when you compare it with what these adult Jays can do. So the next one I want to come to is looking at mental time travel. And by that I mean the ability to remember the past and plan for the future. And what I'm going to show you next is a short video clip. This is from our BBC Two series called Inside the Animal Mind. There were 3 episodes. I was the super contributor and I wrote the script for it. And I'm going to just show you a short section that sets caching in context and then describes one of our experiments investigating whether jays can plan for the future.
There's a common behaviour in the animal world that seems to be about planning for the future. It's called caching. It's what squirrels do in the autumn, hiding nuts in the ground so they can be dug up and eaten over the winter months. But if caching were an Olympic sport, then the Corvids would be the gold medalists. Most of them seem to do it, much to the annoyance of the squirrels. And this American corvid, the Clark's nutcracker, is the caching king. Researchers have observed how every year it can store and remember the location of thousands of different seeds. This bird truly is the master of memory. But is this just another example of instinctive behaviour to survive the winter? Or is there something far more complex going on? It's a question that's greatly intrigued Professor Nicola Clayton. She studies western scrub jays, another American corvid, renowned for its caching behaviour. Nicky wanted to discover whether they could do more than just remember where they'd buried food in the past.
If they can travel back in their mind's eye to think about the past, can they also travel forward in the mind's eye to think about the future? Can they imagine the future, if you like? Can they plan ahead?
To find out, Nicky created an experiment based on a very human annoyance: waking up to find that breakfast is off the menu. For 6 days, the birds were housed in this aviary, split into 3 zones. In the middle is the dining room, where the birds were fed during the day, and at either end are the bedrooms, where they were kept at night. But there's a twist. Kept overnight in this bedroom, the birds were served an early breakfast. But kept overnight in this one, they got no breakfast and went hungry until mid-morning. The birds experienced this daily routine for almost a week.
So we give them 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the hungry room and 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the room that serves breakfast. But the important point is that the birds themselves didn't know which room they'd end up in on any given day.
But then Nicky changed the test. She allowed the birds to cache food in the evening before bedtime. She placed caching trays in both the hungry and breakfast rooms. The question was, where would they choose to store the food? Nicky wanted to know if the birds could use their past experience of the 2 different rooms and plan for the future, namely for breakfast time tomorrow. The results left no doubt.
What we found is that the birds cache about 5 times as much in the hungry room as they cache in the breakfast room. They can imagine what they're going to need the following morning when they wake up hungry, so they can solve a problem before it's even happened. So what this experiment shows is that the birds can plan for the future.
So the jay's caching behaviour is far more than mere instinct. They have a grasp of the past, but can also anticipate future need and, crucially, plan for it. This skill is very rare in the animal kingdom, and it's the fourth key ability needed to solve problems.
It's called mental time travel. It's the ability to go backwards and forwards in the mind's eye. So it's about projecting yourself in time to remember the past and to imagine the future. And this is what the results look like. You can see that they cache far more food on this novel test in the hungry room than they do in the breakfast room. And in fact, in subsequent experiments, when we've had two different types of breakfast served, so let's say you have eggs in one breakfast room and toast in another breakfast room, then they cache eggs in the breakfast room that serves toast and toast in the breakfast room that serves eggs. So like us, they like their variety. Now we've done similar experiments with children, but we didn't use foods. We didn't want to run the risk of peanut allergies, for example. So instead, rather than having a hungry room and a breakfast room, we had a toy room and a no toy room. So we've used toys instead of food. And we had two experiments. We asked the children where they would like to cache the toys for their next birthday tomorrow, or where they would like to cache the toys for right now. And obviously, if, like the jays, they can imagine what they will want in the future, then of course they should say, we'd like to put them in the no toy room, which is Big Bird's room. Because in the toy room, there are already plenty of toys to play with. And what we find is that when we ask them for tomorrow, for their next birthday, you can see that the 3-year-olds are at chance. Equal numbers are cached in the toy room and the no toy room. It's not until children are 4 and 5 years of age that they want to put the toys in the toy room. But it's not that the 3-year-olds don't understand the basic mechanics of the test, because they have no difficulty selectively putting toys in Big Bird's room when they're asked to do it for right now. It's something about having to imagine the future that they find difficult. So this is the third kind of evidence I'm going to give you. This is now on physical cognition. And this is what we call the Essex fable task, based on the crow and the pitcher. So the bird isn't thirsty in our experiments. They've got these waxworms, the Belgian truffles of the jay world. And the bird is using a stone as a tool to raise the water level so it can reach the worm that it wouldn't otherwise not be able to reach. Now, the advantage of a task like this is because it's so simple, we can manipulate a number of variables. You can ask, for example, is the behaviour goal-directed? Will the bird only put stones in the water if there are worms floating on top? And the answer is yes. If you put the worms on the side, they just go and get the worms. They don't bother to put stones in. You can look at, well, what happens if the worm is not in a liquid like water, but it's in a solid, it's resting on top of sand, say, or it's in a gas, it's miraculously floating in air thanks to a bit of blue tack, and they only put the stones in the liquid. But the one that I want to share with you, because it's the one that's inspired our subsequent experiments, is the case when the bird gets a choice of two types of objects, two types of stones, if you like. Some sink and some float. And the question is, do the birds know, do the jays know that actually it's the ones that sink that need to be put in the water, because that will displace the water level and then they'll get the worm. If they just put the ones that float in, the floating objects will just obscure the worm, the water level will stay where it is and they won't get the worm. So this is how this looks. There you can see the worms on the top, and here on the side you can see marbles that sink and cork balls that float. And here you can see Romero putting in a marble and having a good look. This is his first trial. He tries a cork, some more marbles in there. Has another good look. Decides to remove the offending item. And then takes his worms in peace. And this is what the results look like. The line denotes what would be chance behaviour if they were adding equal numbers of sinking and floating items. But you can see that no, Hoy and Romero put significantly more of the items that sink in the water. So suggesting that they have some understanding that you need the heavy ones that sink to displace the water. Now we can do similar experiments with the children. This is what the child version looks like. Obviously we don't use worms, but there's a little sticker floating in the top, and that can be exchanged for a really funky sticker that says the University of Cambridge, I am as clever as a crow on it, which the children love. And here you can see the little child picking up the tiny sticker that floats in exchange for another one. Now you might wonder, well, why don't I do that with the birds? Why don't I use a token exchange? And the problem is that the jays then go off and cache the stickers, and we have devil's own job trying to get the stickers back, and then the next trial they've come with 3 of their own stickers and inserted into the tube. So that's why we only use the worms for the jays. So this is what happens when we give them the choice of ones that sink and float. This is a 6-year-old child. And I think you can see that he hasn't quite got the plot and didn't really look too happy about it either. This is what an 8-year-old child does. And indeed, we see quite a striking developmental trajectory. You can see that 4- and 5-year-old children are at chance. By 6 and 7, they're starting to be able to do it, but certainly they can't do it immediately. They need quite a lot of experience before they get any good. And you can see the 8, 9 and 10-year-old children are pretty good. The final bit, I want to wrap up by looking at why we think these crows might have these seemingly sophisticated cognitive abilities. And one hypothesis that's been proposed to explain why humans have these abilities and other non-human primates as well is what's called social relationship intelligence. In fact, Nick Humphrey's original hypothesis was arguing that the higher intellectual faculties of primates evolved as an adaptation to the complexities of social living. So what he argued was that it wasn't so much their physical skills that set primates apart from other animals, it was their social skills. And in a famous book, Chimpanzee Politics, Frans de Waal describes the kind of complex relationships and social interactions that one kind of primate, the chimpanzee, does, arguing that they form these long-term alliances or positive affiliations with other individuals in the group, and that these are maintained by grooming, by actively sharing food. Now, what we've argued is that in principle this social functional, social relationship hypothesis could apply to any group of long-lived animals that forms complex social interactions. And there's good evidence that the Corvids do just that. For example, you see parliaments of rooks, where you see these colonial birds engaged in these long-term affiliations with other individuals. And we found that rooks, like chimpanzees, form long-term alliances. They also maintain relationships by active food sharing, as you can see here. Obviously they can't groom, they don't have hands, but they can preen. And they also, whereas chimpanzees with their lips kiss after fights, we find that the rooks and the jays and the other corvids do bill twining. And there's pictured here, and actually if you get up close enough to them, you can see that it seriously looks a bit like French kissing. There's a lot of tongue action going on between the birds. And in fact, one of the drivers of social relationship intelligence is thought to be the challenge of monogamy, of being paired husband and wife, if you like. And I love this Randy Glasberg cartoon where she says, when you've been married a long time, you get to know what the other person thinks. He's less certain of this, of course. Oh, no, you don't. Now, we find that our birds pair for life. They are monogamous, so one male with one female, and they go to great lengths to be extremely synchronous. So this is two rooks, this is Cook and Fry. They've been paired together for 8 years now, and you can see just how synchronous they are. And you can really see there's a leader and a follower, and as a dancer I think of this as avian tango, because in Argentine tango, it's very much that the leader signals his intent to move, and then the follower and the leader move as one. They often talk about it as being, it's an animal with 4 legs and 2 beating hearts because of the synchronicity of the movements that go on in tango. So one reason then why the corvids might have evolved these complex cognitive abilities is because, like the chimpanzees, the other great apes, they're highly social, and that might have been a driver for more general intelligence in the form of this mental time travel and physical problem solving, as well as social cognition. And indeed, our birds rapidly, reliably use and make a suite of tools in the laboratory. But the last experiment that I want to show you concerns this food sharing behaviour, because the birds don't only use it for maintaining these social relationships, but by manipulating what the male or female wants, we're able to ask questions about whether the male jay can understand what his partner wants. So sometimes we call it happy wife, happy life. So in the food sharing test, the male sits at the window, as you can see here, and this is the food sharing window. And what he does first is he watches what the female eats, and then he's offered 2 foods, the food she's just eaten and the other food. And now he has a choice of which food to give her. So these are called mealworms and waxworms, 2 of the jay's most favourite food. And then in the share phase, the male has the opportunity to share the food with the female. So what we wanted to know is whether the male would know what the female wants to eat. And the way we manipulate this is we use something called specific satiety. And in specific satiety, the idea is if you're given one food to eat until you've had as much of the food as you want, and then you're given a choice of that food and a different food, you'll always choose the different food, providing you like both foods. So you're sated on one food, and it's specific to the food that you were sated on. You can think of it as the dessert principle. You've just been out for a nice meal, you've had a lovely main course. If somebody said, did you want another one? You'd say, no thanks. But somehow you can always find room for the dessert because it's something completely different. So what we do here is, first of all, we establish that specific satiety is working. So we have a pre-feeding phase in which the bird is given the opportunity to eat either waxworms in the blue bowl with the W, or mealworms in the green bowl labelled M, and both males and females get this. And then they, having eaten until satiety, they're given the choice of both foods. And of course what they should do, if our manipulation has worked, is having eaten lots of mealworms, they should want waxworms. if they've eaten a lot of waxworms, they should want mealworms. And we see this here. This is the average difference in the amount of worms eaten in the specific satiety experiment. And then if they've just been pre-fed the mealworms, they're much more likely to want waxworms than if they've just been pre-fed waxworms. And you might say, well, why are we doing it with these worms versus pre-fed maintenance diet? Well, that's because we get quite a big variation between individual birds in how much they eat. So Hoy can eat 100 waxworms and not get full, whereas little Wiggins has more like my kind of appetite. After she's had about 20 worms, she's full. So we have to do it relative to the maintenance diet so that we do it in terms of based on how much overall they can eat. So that's just to show that our manipulation works. So now the idea is that what we want to do is that in the experimental condition, the male is going to see the female eat waxworms or mealworms until she's sated. And the idea is that if he can understand what she will want, then irrespective of what he wants, he should give her the different food, the food she's not just eaten until she is sated. And we have a control condition in which he doesn't get to see what she can eat, because we want to make sure that it's because of what he's seen her eat and not just because of her behaviour. It might be that having eaten loads of waxworms just shows absolutely no interest to the waxworms, and all he has to do is look at, well, she's not looking at that bowl, she's looking at the other one. So that's why we have the two conditions. So the idea is that in the seen condition, if he's just seen her eat lots of waxworms, he should feed her lots of mealworms. If he's just seen her eat lots of mealworms, he should feed her lots of waxworms. The idea is that if that's because of what he's seen, then in the unseen condition, he shouldn't know what to feed her because he doesn't know what she wants, because he hasn't seen which kind of food she was sated on. So this is what the seen condition looks like, and sure enough, he's much more likely to give her waxworms when he's seen her eat a load of mealworms, when she's been pre-fed on mealworms, than when she's been pre-fed on waxworms. So, yeah, when he's seen, he's able to give her the food that she wants. He's not able to do so in the unseen condition. There's no difference between the amount of worms given when he's seen her eat, when he doesn't know which kind of worms she's been pre-fed on. Now, of course, at this point, you could say, well, okay, so he needs to see her eat, but what if it's nothing to do with what she wants? What if it's simply that having seen eating of a lot of one kind of food, you just naturally want the other one, irrespective of your own motivational state? So to test that, we ran what we call the observational specific satiety experiment. Now, he watches her eat one of the two foods, but in the test phase, she's flown off into the main aviary, and he has the opportunity to choose worms to feed himself, but he has no opportunity to feed her. And we want to know whether just having seen her eat lots of one kind of food is going to predispose him to do the other food, or whether it's really when he's seen her eat, he's understanding about her motivational state. Well, you can see that once he's seen her eat one of the foods, that doesn't affect his choice of what to feed himself in the observational satiety. So it's not just seeing her eat, it's seeing her eat and then having the opportunity to eat himself. And that's quite different from in the normal specific satiety, where he's actually eaten the food himself. So, just to wind up, in my final slide, I've shown you that the crows are capable of relatively sophisticated social cognition in the form of these competitive interactions of protecting their caches from stealing, and in these cooperative ones with food sharing, with feeding his female what she wants to eat. I've also talked in terms of mental time travel and their ability to plan for tomorrow's breakfast, and I also showed you evidence of physical problem solving in the Essex fable water tusk. So I'd love to say that I was the first person to discover the cognitive complexities of Corvids, but alas no, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher got there long before me in the early 1800s. He said if men had wings and bore black feathers, few of them would be clever enough to be crows. So with that, I would finish. I would like to thank my birds and my collaborators and my lab and the funding bodies, without whom none of this would be possible. And I would like to thank all of you for listening tonight. So thank you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. And now we do have time for a couple of questions. If anyone would like to ask Nikki any questions just now.
Well, first I'd like to ask, what did you mean by... first I'd like to ask, what did you mean by children beginning to understand functionality? Like, what kind of tasks and skills would that involve?
Well, the experiment I showed you was one in which we deliberately manipulated whether or not the tools should work. So we simply had either ones that sink or ones that float. So that was one understanding, that in the water test, the idea is that it's only going to be ones that sink that's going to raise the water level. Ones that float aren't going to change the water level. But people have done a number of other kinds of things where they've asked whether children can understand cause and effect relationships between things. So this one works because it pushes into that one and moves that one. This one doesn't work because it just touches it and doesn't move it forwards. And there's a whole suite of experiments like that that have been done. There's something that people in the States, Alison Gopnik, for example, looks at a lot with Blicket detectors, where you have these bits of apparatus and all of a sudden it lights up and makes a nice noise, and the children have to understand what would be the cause of that, why this one has worked and that one hasn't worked. So in these cases, functionality, you can think of it as being logically what kinds of things would work, or what kinds of things do I expect to work, and what kinds of things don't I expect to work.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask another question? Sorry, very good questions. Is there any difference if the female is feeding the male in the sort of specific satiety experiment?
The only real difference is that the females are by and large smaller than the males, and so they tend to have, they tend to eat less. They have not such a big appetite, but both the females can feed the males and the males can feed the females. It's just that in the experiment I showed you, because of the limits of time, I just showed you one example where we've simply asked whether the males can feed the females and do they know what to feed them. And we have a series of experiments that we're looking at, for example, if the male actually wants the different food from the female, so now his desire is in conflict with hers. So let's say he really wants waxworms, but he's seen she's full of waxworms and she really wants mealworms. Can he still give her the mealworms even though he loves the waxworms? And the answer to that is yes. And what we've been doing recently is to do other kinds of experiments where, for example, he only sees her eat one item of food instead of a whole bowl of food, and then he doesn't feed her the other food. So we're starting to ask questions now about exactly what kind of information can he use to inform his choices of what kinds of food to feed her and how much.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
More questions, please?
How many children were tested?
We used 10 children per age group in each experiment. So quite a big sample size overall.
Okay, further questions?
Thank you for that. Do you know anything about the ages at which the Corvids develop these abilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're just starting to look at that now. It's been quite difficult to do because traditionally the research funding that we get is for 3 years and the birds take a long time to develop. But we now have a big long-term grant which is allowing us to start looking at the age at which some of these things develop. So we're testing the baby jays at the moment, actually.
With the naive birds that don't rehide their stashes, what if, if a bird has seen another bird look at its stash but hasn't stolen it itself, will it still never hide?
So what we know is that those birds who have been thieves themselves rehide it. Birds that have been victims, have had their caches stolen, do it as well. But birds who have just observed other birds' cache and haven't had the opportunity to steal and haven't had experience of having their stashes stolen, even if they didn't actually see the thief in action, don't do it. So observation alone isn't enough. They need to have some of this victim or theft experience.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we'll all be watching children and birds much more carefully in the future. Thank you so much for giving us such a fascinating talk, giving us so much to think about. And I just want to say thank you very much. This is a small token of a traditional Scottish gift of a quaig for you.
Oh, how beautiful.
I'd like to say to everybody, we have some wine and nibbles outside. If anyone would like to join us with those, you can ask and maybe some more questions out there. And let's finish by thanking her once more for a really interesting talk. Thank you.